All right, hello and welcome into today's video. Today we're going to be talking about how you can win in business following the laws of thermodynamics. Werner von Braun is an aerospace engineer from a controversial past, but he states that science has found that nothing can disappear without a trace, and nature does not know extinction. All that nature knows is transformation. So what we're going to be talking about today is specifically today's entrepreneurial fallacy, the law of conservation of energy, the specific law of thermodynamics we're going to be talking about, why your energy isn't disappearing, why you should stop measuring outcomes and measure inputs instead, why the grass isn't always greener on the other side, and the way that you can commit the law into your life. So today's entrepreneurial fallacy is all about the unrealistic expectations that new and young entrepreneurs coming into the online space have about what it takes to be successful. In the contemporary business landscape, a lot of these early stage entrepreneurs are being overtaken by a psychological miasma. Miasma is a highly unpleasant or unhealthy influence that is suggesting to them that wealth is just a matter of hacks or secret shortcuts, essentially get rich quick schemes. It's a cultural obsession that's having rapid results, and it's birthed a generation of entrepreneurs that are suffering from SOS, which is shiny object syndrome. Shiny object syndrome is the tendency to abandon a current path in favor of a new path that seems more attractive or like a better opportunity. As a result of all of these young entrepreneurs having shiny object syndrome, what we are now having is a graveyard of businesses that were started and then ultimately immediately stopped, and then young people jumping from business model to business model, chasing the one that will favor them the quickest and give them the most immediate success. Now, all of these young people are not failing because they have bad ideas or they're not good at what they're doing, but they're failing because they don't understand the first law of thermodynamics, which is the law of conservation of energy, and how that law applies to human effort. They're treating the energy that they're dispensing into a certain business model as something that can simply be discarded and restarted without penalty. But what they fail to realize is that the true traction that they're going to get in order to become successful will be the result of the accumulation of understanding in a constant state of motion. And what that means is that as they accumulate understanding in a certain vertical, let's say it would be e-commerce, let's say it would be info, let's say it would be building a SaaS product, does not matter the mechanism. As they progress and accumulate more understanding, they're constantly going to be in motion of that subset of understanding, and as a result, they will constantly progress forward. Unfortunately, that is not the case with most of today's young entrepreneurs because of what they see online. All they want is the quick success, and they're not getting it, so they're jumping over to the next model that they think will give them a quick win. So in order to better understand exactly what I'm talking about here and how they need to better understand the laws of thermodynamics and how those apply to success in business, we need to first understand what the law of conservation of energy actually is and how you can produce directional consistency using this law. So the first law of thermodynamics states that energy cannot be created nor can it be destroyed. It can only be transferred from one form to another form. Now, you might be asking yourself, Tristan, what the heck does that mean when it comes to business? I've only learned this in high school, or maybe I didn't learn it at all, and it was only for chemical reactions. I would agree with you, but the truth is this law applies to all facets of life, especially business, and you'll see why in a moment. So in business, the energy that you expend never vanishes. What it is doing is it's merely waiting to be converted into what we are referring to as liquidity. For you, that liquidity is going to be the availability of cash or into an easily convertible asset. When you're putting in inputs, you're creating potential energy, and when that potential energy ultimately develops into something real, it then becomes kinetic energy. So every action that you take that doesn't result in the outcome that you're looking for is stored as potential energy. Some examples of that would be market intelligence, skill acquisition, and brand equity. So every time you get rejected in business, you get a data point. You're learning something specific about the heuristics, the practical hands-on methods of problem solving in your specific niche. Skill acquisition. Your ability to handle objections or write copy is a form of stored energy that increases your future skill velocity. So what would happen is if you take a sales call and you get rejected and they do not purchase, but they provide you with an objection, that is an objection that you can then handle in the future, or ultimately you can change around your marketing copy in a way that pre-handles it before they would ever get on a sales call. Now, brand equity is all about building microscopic levels of trust. Even if a prospect says no, you and your brand have gained a foothold in their psyche. Just because they do not buy on day one does not mean that they will not buy on day 2, 3, or 4. They might have just needed to go through some personal development in order to be in a position to buy or consume more of your content, whatever the reason may be. So as you can see here in this graphic, essentially what you're doing is pushing a boulder up a hill. And every time you push that boulder a centimeter or a meter further up the hill, you are creating potential energy for that boulder to fall back down, right? But as we're pushing that boulder up, the energy isn't disappearing into nothing. It's being transformed into the 3 things that we talked about before. So when it comes to vectors, the math of failure is explained as follows. If you're applying a magnitude of 10 in 5 different directions, let's say we're going 10 this way, 10 this way, 10 this way, 10 this way, your net displacement is going to end up being 0 because you're moving one way, but then you're moving back in another way. But if you were to translate that into the math of success, which is just all about compounding results, if you're applying a magnitude of 2 in the same direction 5 times, one forward step, another forward step, another forward step, you end up moving 10 units forward. So what that all means together is that directional consistency is the only way to achieve the kinetic energy that you need in order to succeed, which is that energy in motion. Now, this next part that we want to cover is extremely important to understand if you're someone who thinks that when failures come your way, it's the end of the world and that you should probably pack it up and go do something else. Now, that is what I call the myth of wasted effort, right? And so the reason that people have a hard time progressing is because they think that when they put energy into something and they don't get the output, that energy, strictly speaking, goes away. But the reality is that's not the case. So many entrepreneurs abandon their ventures because they feel that their effort has disappeared because it hasn't manifested itself as the liquidity that we talked about in part 1, the availability of liquid assets, essentially your cash, to you as a company or to your company as a whole, right? This is misunderstanding at its core what kinetic energy versus potential energy is. So the first concept that is going to help you progress when it comes to creating potential energy, translating itself into kinetic energy, is the concept of accumulation. When you as a rep or as a business owner make 50 sales calls and receive 50 rejections, the energy that you put into those sales calls is stored as potential energy in the form of these 3 things: refinement, recognition, and statistical certainty. Refinement is that your pitch is now 50 iterations sharper. Now, if you're not iterating and changing your pitch based on objections that you're receiving and pre-handling those, throughout the sales call, those types of things, well, then you're strictly speaking just bad at what you do. But if you're someone who knows how to make data-driven decisions and make changes based on data, then you know that every time you get an objection, you're going to be able to handle it differently the next time. And that's refinement. The second is recognition. So 50 people that you've spoken to now know your name, even if they said no today. The possibility that they had a problem that you, strictly speaking, could not solve at that time, or the problem wasn't deep enough for them to be solved with thousands upon thousands of dollars, in a lot of our cases in the online space, that doesn't mean that they're never going to buy your product. That just means that right then and there, they didn't want to, but now you're in the back of their head if that problem ever becomes a massive pain point for them, more so than it was already. Then we have statistical certainty, which is really just the law of averages. So when you take sales calls as a business owner, you likely have a certain close rate. Let's say on average as an owner, you close your calls at 35%. Well, every time you take a sales call, you get one step closer to a yes if your average close rate based on data is 35%, right? So if you take 50 calls, then that means that the volume is very large, but you are 50 calls closer to the yes that's dictated by the conversion rate that we just mentioned. Now, the problem that a lot of people have is they don't see this law of accumulation as the creation of potential energy. They see it as wasted energy because they're not receiving the output. And as a result, they either get depressed or they suffer the reset penalty, which is even worse. So in thermodynamics, every time energy is transferred, some of that energy is lost as what is called entropy, right? It's disorder or randomness in a system. It's just basically the cost of doing business when it comes to chemistry or physics, pardon me. Now in business, switching models is what is considered a high entropy event. If you're pushing a boulder up a hill in order to get it to the top, but then you see a different mountain that has a less steep slope that you think you'll have an easier time pushing the boulder up, well, any momentum that you gain pushing the boulder up on hill A will be lost because you're going to now go to hill number B, or hill B, sorry. So you lose the momentum of your existing network, you lose the momentum of the existing work that you already put in, you lose the muscle memory of your niche's language, and you even lose the authority that you were slowly building in the specific marketplace that you were working in. Now this next point is quite detailed, and it's called the multiplication through intersection. In the market, real wisdom is gained through intersection of consistent actions. The 2 points that we're going to cover are cross-pollination and illustration. Cross-pollination is all about staying in one model that allows your skills to feed your product development, which in turn feeds your marketing. So the more data points you have to work off of, the better marketing materials you can actually make, and as a result, the more you know your audience, the more money you make. And then illustration is all about learning the nuances of a single niche for 2 years to make you a specialist in that specific niche. And because of that, your insights multiply every single time you gain more insight into that niche. Switching every 6 months leaves you as a perpetual generalist. So to put that into an example, if you know the business models of e-com, SaaS, info, coaching, outbound, so cold email and all these things. But if you've read Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill, you know that the riches aren't in the generalists. The riches are in the specialists. People don't want a solution that provides them with a general result. They're always going to want a specific solution to a specific problem that they have that someone specifically knows how to solve. There's a lot more trust in that and a lot more money as well. So if you're asking yourself at this point, okay, all of this theory is fantastic. How do I actually put it into practice in my business? And what can I do differently other than just changing from business model to business model to actually improve upon my situation and change around what I'm doing right at this moment? Well, what you're going to want to do is just shift your metrics, right? So as opposed to measuring yourself on the outcomes, start measuring yourself on the inputs that you put in order to achieve those outcomes. Because the most significant psychological barrier to success is outcome dependency. In order to succeed, you must first measure the energy inputs with receipts. You want to have quantifiable actions of your inputs that you can yourself verify. In business, we're going to go very general here, and we're going to create 5 fundamental energy units, which are the atoms of your business. If you're going to provide enough of these units, the law of conservation of energy will dictate that they must eventually transform into results. Now, that result may show up in different ways, but it will be a result nonetheless. Now, we'll take a quick pause here before we get into these, but let me tell you, or I hope that you understand that that is a law of the universe. It's a law of thermodynamics. This is not, a theoretical law. This is absolute truth. So as long as you put in the work into the right system, the right vehicle, the results will guaranteed eventually come. So in business, you're going to want to use any number of, input metrics that you want to measure based on your niche. It doesn't need to be these 5 specifically, but just to keep it general, we're going to use these ones. The first one is going to be direct conversations. So this is going to be one-on-one interactions with potential buyers or people who might be interested in your product. This is your system's thermal input. The second one is going to be offers made, which is going to be explicitly asking for money in exchange for value. Without an offer, there is no work done in the physical sense, right? In the sense of the function of work. Then we're going to have follow-ups, which will just be re-engaging with previous leads. This acts as insulation for your business, preventing energy from leaking out of the funnel. So we talked about that entropy earlier, right? Which is just the cost of doing business. This prevents, overly large amounts of entropy. It makes it so that a lot more of your effort is consistently fed back into the mechanism. Then we have content pieces, so that would be public assets that build your gravity, pulling prospects towards you without active effort. We all know about gravity, otherwise we'd float away. And then we have sales repetitions. So the total count of pitches or presentations that you make to prospects. Now this increases the efficiency of your energy conversion. Here's a little bit of a table that'll kind of show you like how many of each you could realistically make on a given week. And if you achieve these, then you know that you're putting in the inputs required to eventually achieve a certain output. Now, what this all means in practice, before we get into the last section here, is that if I have 50 direct conversations, I make 10 offers, I follow up with 30 people, I have 3 content pieces posted, and I have 5 sales repetitions. Well, there is no guarantee that because of all of those things, I'm going to close a deal or achieve a certain outcome that I desire. But what it does mean is that in the future, the compound effect of my efforts are going to come to fruition in some form. Maybe 2 weeks from this day, I get a follow-up or someone follows up with me from a direct conversation that I had, because it's now of interest to them to purchase my product or at least have a conversation about it. Maybe the sales call that I took 2 weeks before this that didn't end up in a close because the timing wasn't right for them, I followed up, and as a result, we're back in the mix, we're back in the conversation. So just be patient with the results of your actions, but be impatient with actually taking the actions themselves. Now, the last point, and arguably the most important one, is that the activation energy that you're putting in is very important. And the grass is always greener on the other side fallacy is massively abundant in today's entrepreneurial landscape, especially in the online space. Now, to illustrate this point, what I want to do is give you a practical example from real life that we most likely all know, and if you don't, you're likely living under a rock. So Rome, the capital of Italy, I really hope that's the case. If not, then that's embarrassing. But Rome wasn't built in a day. You've probably heard this expression before. This is a description of accumulated mass. A city, a country, a railroad, anything, they're all like business, and they require a specific amount of work in order to, or a specific amount of work to exist in order to achieve their final productive form, right? Rome, obviously, final productive form would be a functional city. A business, final productive form would be collecting cash and providing a service. Second point that we want to make here is the activation energy threshold. So in chemistry, the activation energy threshold is the minimum energy required to trigger a reaction within a system. Now, 2 things are true when it comes to the activation energy threshold in business. Number 1 is the dip. So most entrepreneurs quit when they are at 90% of the activation energy required to achieve a certain result. Because they do not see a flame, in our case profit, they assume that the fuel, in our case the business model, is broken. Now, to help you visualize this, imagine that you have a pot of water on a stove and you're waiting for it to boil. Let's say it takes 8 minutes on high to boil a liter of water or half a liter of water. And you're sitting there, you have it on high, and it's bubbling a little bit, but it hasn't boiled yet. And at 7 minutes, you decide that because it hasn't boiled yet, you've put in all of this, energy into having it boil, all this gas, all this heat, and the water has not boiled yet. So you turn off the heat. And as a result, the water never does boil because the heat's been turned off. The activation energy threshold was never met. But had you left it for another 60 seconds, you would have hit the activation energy threshold, the water would have boiled, and you would have made a profit in a business sense. It's the same as that meme that we've all seen probably online of that guy. It's kind of like a ironic one, but that guy who is mining for diamonds or whatever, and he stops like right before the diamonds and then leaves. But the other guy stops or keeps going, 3 feet and gets all the diamonds. So the same law applies here. Now, the opposite side of the spectrum, if you were to, continue mining those diamonds, waiting that extra 60 seconds to boil the water, you achieve exothermic breakthrough. Now, once you hit the threshold, the business becomes exothermic and it begins releasing more energy, profit, than you are actually putting in, right? So all of these inputs that we did here, in our weekly targeting that we did in the last section, these all were leading up to an activation energy threshold. Now, eventually we're going to put in enough inputs and enough energy into the system that all of the energy we were putting in before that was leading to a certain level of output, profit, are not going to be required to achieve that level of profit anymore. We're going to achieve likely even more profit without putting in nearly as much effort. Business owners who think long-term understand this better than anyone. Business owners who don't think long-term and are constantly chasing that next, I want to hit $10,000 per month, I want to do this, I want to do that, they don't understand that at all, right? And that's a lot of the online business world because so many young people are entering it and they don't have maybe the wisdom to understand that. So the psychological deviation from what is actually needed is the belief that a different model is going to be easier, and that's a deviation from the reality, right? So unfortunately, if you're building a SaaS product, and building a SaaS product is hard, and one of your friends is doing good with cold email or something like that, or an e-commerce store, you cannot see the friction that they are dealing with in order to get their results, right? The friction is the resistance that the object isn't going to encounter when moving over another. And you can't see that in a model that you haven't tried yet, right? You understand the friction in your own business, but you cannot see it in a different business model. That's the fallacy of the grass is always greener on the other side. Moving from e-commerce to SMMA doesn't remove that friction, or moving from, whatever example we gave before, the friction is not removed in a different system. It simply swaps the friction that you would get from one thing and swaps it for a different kind of friction. So you're just better off overcoming the friction that you already understand and that you're already dealing with than jumping to a different one. And so to visualize what this activation energy curve looks like is, here we have the struggle times of business, right? The accumulation phase and everything like that. And it's met by time and consistent efforts and results plus visible success. So here we have the linear line on the, the y-axis of the activation energy threshold. So this is all the bad times of business. And then as soon as we hit this little point here, this is where we really get the success that we've been looking for. So these are the dog days. And then as you can see here, it's exponential. So the effort we're putting in is significantly reduced, but the success, or the visible success we're getting, is significantly increased. Now everything we've talked about in this video is, absolute truth, and it's the law of thermodynamics, it's the law of conservation of energy, but it's not a mystery, and nor is success. Success is measurable, success has been seen on a consistent basis and with consistent proven mechanisms over the course of the years. So, it is a mathematical certainty that if you put the inputs in and you are consistent with it and you have a fixed direction, you will succeed. Your previous efforts are never lost. They are what we call latent. They're waiting for you to add the final units of energy required to reach the tipping point, or as we just described for a few minutes, the activation energy threshold. Now, the shiny object syndrome that a lot of us are dealing with, I have dealt with in the past, this is what we call a mirage. It promises essentially, success without required effort or required input or friction in general. Success without friction, right? Result without friction, that does not exist. It promises a world without the laws of thermodynamics. Every profitable venture that you ever create, and I know you will create them over the course of your life, they're all going to require the same transformation of effort into value, and you're going to do this through the refusal to reset your progress to zero. If you are in the middle right now of pushing a boulder up a hill, and you see a friend pushing a boulder up a different hill, and that hill seems less steep than your hill, do not let your boulder roll down the hill and try to scale the next hill. Focus on your hill. That is your hill. You know that hill the best. You will achieve success with that hill. Focus on that alone. If you're wondering what you should be doing after consuming this content and how you could probably and practically apply it to your life and your business, I would simply just stop evaluating your bank account for the next 30 days. Stop evaluating the cash you collect. Stop evaluating how much money you're making. Stop evaluating the output that you're putting out in your business, at least for you as a business, obviously not for your clients. Instead, what you should do is just follow a 30-day input protocol. Take the things that you know will help you achieve success in your vertical for either yourself or your clients and apply it to your business. And make sure that every single day you are putting in the minimum input level required in order to hit your activation energy threshold, the one specifically needed for your situation. So stop measuring on outcomes, start measuring on the inputs required to achieve those outcomes, and your life will get a hell of a lot less stressful because it's no longer based around what can I achieve, it's based around what did I do today in order to achieve. If you have any questions, I absolutely love this shit. I am obsessed with the principles of, the universe and the laws that go into what becoming successful is all about. If you want to just have a conversation about it, feel free to hit me up on Instagram at tristan.vds. I would be happy to help you better understand this or better understand something that you're dealing with in your business or in your life. I'm all about the progression of the self and the discovery of better business practice. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I will see you guys in the next one.